Okay, the first thing we did was we took out all 8 coil packs, and there are 16 spark plugs in the Hemi 5.7. You run into some problems. Some of the boots will break basically because of the age, but you can still buy new ones online, not a big deal. Took out 1 spark plug from each head so I could use my inspection camera that I just bought at Harbor Freight. But like I said, I put the inspection camera down each hole and determined that it was the number 7 cylinder head in the back here on the driver's side. And I'll see if I can show you how we came up with that conclusion. So we put it down here. And then you can look at the little 2.3-inch screen, I believe it is. And it'll show you what the top of the piston looks like. And you can see the valve guide broke up and was bouncing around in there. That's why there's some damage. And it looks like there's actually a piece of the piston missing right there. And try to show you, maybe through the other hole, there's a piece of the valve seat sitting in the bottom there. It's kind of cool. You can see the threads on the spark plug holes as you go down. And aha, right in the bottom, see if we can see it right there, looks like it's a piece of the valve seat. Anyway, to remove the coil packs is pretty simple. There's 2 10mm bolts that hold each one on, and then 1 electrical connector that clicks in. Just press it down and pull it off. Be careful with the connectors though, they're pretty brittle, especially with the age of these vehicles. This one's going on 12 years old. Okay, then you want to take off the fuel injection harness. Pick up on these little red things here. Sometimes they need a little bit of persuasion with a screwdriver. Just push them up about 1/4 inch. Press in here underneath them, where my finger is, and then just slowly rock them back and forth and they'll all come off. And another thing you want to do is the wire harness is all on top of these bolts with studs on them. So I just got a pry bar that's been modified before. I cut the section out of it so I could do rear dually brakes or something like that. And if you get under there, you can just barely slide it up and get all the wire harness things off here. And that'll make it a lot easier. Okay, now we're going to lift the intake manifold. Like we did earlier, we disconnected all the fuel injectors, 4 on each side. And then right here, there's 5 8mm bolts that hold the injection down to the cylinder heads. And then there's a vacuum hose in the back behind the intake that goes to your power brake booster. That's a little tough to get off. And then on the other side, you got the fuel line, and then you got another vacuum hose with a canister on it that comes up here and it's part of the emission system or something like that. And then the big thing you want to take off is this EGR tube. It connects down here and goes up into your intake. Okay, in addition to the brake booster hose, there's also a wiring harness that goes back there, and it's held in with a little clip that's a little bit difficult to get off also. But like I said, after you get everything removed, it just lifts off easy. It's plastic, it's not that heavy. And it's off. Okay, these are the bolts that hold on the valve covers. There are 10 on each one. And some are a little difficult to get to, but the one on the passenger side rear is the most difficult to, and we'll show you how we got to that one. All the way down in the corner, if you can see it, is an 8mm deep 1/4 inch socket, and it's connected to about a 6-inch wobbly extension, which is attached to a 8-inch normal 1/4 inch extension, which is attached to another 8-inch wobbly extension. And we're able to fish it through here, and that way you can actually get to it. So, just to be warned, the passenger side lower one and the rear is the hardest one to get to, but it is possible. Okay, as you can see, I've already taken off the belt on this, the serpentine belt, and the reason you got to do that is because you got to take off the power steering pump. Doesn't look that bad. There's a bunch of holes in the power steering pump so you can get in through and get the bolts here. And now for the valve covers. We got all 10 bolts off on this side. And that side looks actually really clean for 225,000 miles. And we'll pull the other side off. Like I said, this is the side we had trouble with the rear bolt over here, but we got it. Had a little problem around the dipstick and the wire harness on the bottom here. The bottom wire harness had the same type of clips as the fuel injection harness, so those were a little tough to get off too. And now we're stuck in the back. And I see the problem. It's the wire harness connector that goes over the bolt studs for the valve covers holding this in. And there it goes. A little more difficult than the other side, but just as clean in there. Okay, we took the passenger side head off first. I figured this is the more difficult of the two, that's why we did it. It's pretty straightforward. There's 10 head bolts that hold it in, and then there's 5, I don't know if you want to call them mini head bolts or what they are. But the hardest part is in the back. There's a ground strap that goes through here, and there's a stud on the back of the head, so you got to take that off. And then you also got your dipstick on this side, so you got to make sure you take that off, because the wire harness will get in the way when you go to pull the head, and you still got the dipstick attached to the head. And then the exhaust manifold down here, there's actually 4 bolts holding this exhaust manifold on. 2 hold the catalytic converter to the exhaust manifold, and then there's a heat shield that go over it, and there's 2 more bolts on top of that, so there's 4 bolts on this side in between the catalytic converter and the exhaust manifold. We took the exhaust manifold off with the head because it was easier. You couldn't even see the exhaust bolts on this side. But if you want to come over here, we'll take a look at the head. And it doesn't look too bad. The only thing I see is on the rear cylinder over here, this is where one of the valve seats dropped. There's about probably a little bit less than 1/4 inch, but you can definitely see how this valve sits higher than the other valves. So there's definitely a problem here. It hasn't destroyed the piston yet, but we'll have to take off the other side and see if there's any more damage over there. O2 sensor, you also have to undo that. And this one's kind of difficult to get to. We lifted the head and pulled it forward, and this is like right behind there, so it's hard to get your hands in there. So it's a 2-person job. Have one person lift the cylinder head and support it forward while the other undoes the O2 sensor wire. Okay, we got the driver's side head off. This is the easier of the two because the fuel injection harness, you can swing it out of the way and put it on the side. The other side has the alternator connected to it, so you could probably just disconnect it from the alternator too and swing that electrical harness away. The only difference is on this one you have the power steering pump, which we talked about earlier. There's just 3 bolts holding that on. Not a big deal. You can just unscrew it and just let it sit in place. And then of course this one also has the oxygen sensor in the back, which is also a big pain, just like the other side was. And then the same thing, we took it off with the exhaust manifold and just disconnected the exhaust manifold and the first catalytic converter apart. But that's the easiest way to do it. And 2-person job. I had my cameraman help me for this. That's why we couldn't take a picture of the head coming off. But there it is. As you can see, the rear cylinder, like we suspected, we went in there with the inspection camera, and we were able to see the damage in there, and that piston is busted up pretty good because the valve seat broke apart in there and was bouncing around. Also, if you look at cylinder number 1, it's got a little bit of damage on the top here, and the intake valve dropped on that one. where on the rear cylinder was an exhaust valve. And we'll show you those in a second over here. Here's the rear. Like I said, it's got all the damage from the valve seat in there, busted up and bouncing around. But that, I believe, was the exhaust valve. But if you look over on cylinder 1, this is pretty obvious. There's your exhaust valve right there.
Intake.
Excuse me, your intake valve seat. And it hasn't broken up yet, but that was probably some of the noise we have. And like I said, it shows a little bit of damage on that number 1 piston, but I think we can get away with it. And the rear, we're definitely going to have to change the piston. But overall, not too bad of a job so far. How to remove the electric fans off a Dodge Magnum. Probably the same as a Dodge Charger or a Chrysler 300. Anyway, it's not too bad. The hardest thing is it goes out through the bottom. First thing you got to do is disconnect the electrical connection right here. Just push in on this and pull it apart. And then there's 2 10mm bolts that hold it in. One on the top over here and one on the top over here. And after you get that bolt done, it'll swing forward like this. On the bottom, it's got 2 little clips that hold it into place. So you have to pull up on the shroud, and then, like I said, it goes down through the bottom. We'll do that now. Okay, something you got to watch out for is it gets hung up on the electric connector right here, coming down past the power steering hose. But other than that, it's not too bad. You don't have to get it too far off the ground. Just get it on some car ramps like I did, and it'll just barely give you enough room. But it almost looks like there's enough room to take it out of the top, but there's not. It's got to come through the bottom. Okay, decided to clean the piston since I had the heads off. It's really not that hard of a job. What you want to do is get the pistons on top dead center, and it's pretty easy to do without the heads on it. Have somebody go below the car and just turn on the crank pulley, and then have somebody at the top tell you when this piston is up, and then there'll be a corresponding one on the other side that's also up, so you can clean 2 at once. I tried carburetor cleaner, didn't really work. Tried some brake cleaner, didn't work. Tried some PB blaster, didn't work. Tried a brass wire brush, didn't work, and now I just got a metal wire brush. And it works pretty good. That is 225,000 miles of carbon coming off right there. Okay, in this segment we have to take off the oil pan because we need to replace a piston. So anyway, in order to take down the oil pan, there are 19 10mm bolts that hold the oil pan on. And then there's also, in the rear here by the transmission, there's 4 15mm bolts that also hold the oil pan on. And then on the side, you also have some additional 15s that hold it to the transmission. Okay, what you do is take out all the bolts, and then you can pry down on the front, and the oil pan will probably drop about 2 or 3 inches. And the reason it's doing that is, let's take off the oil pan seal. You got the oil pickup in here. So what happens when you pull the oil pan down, the pickup catches right here on the oil baffle, but you got enough room to get your hand in there and undo the 1 bolt in the corner and take the oil pickup off. In order to get the oil pan out, though, you need to drop the steering rack. There's only 2 bolts that hold it in, and that'll drop it down about 3 inches. And then you also need to raise up the engine a few inches, probably about 4 or 5 inches. And how you do that is right on the bottom by the steering rack, there's 4 bolts that hold in the lower motor mounts. There's 2 on each side. So take those bolts out, and then we put a strap around the engine to lift it up. We'll show you that in a second. Okay, one more thing you got to do is there's a plate on the back of the oil pan right next to the transmission you got to take off. It's only held in with 1 bolt right here, another 10mm. But this will hurt you trying to get the oil pan down. It won't come out unless you take this bolt out of the way, and that plate. And then these are the bolts, the 2 bolts that hold in the steering rack. One side's a 15mm, and then it's got an 18mm bolt on the other side. Like I said, just pull both of these out and you can pull the steering rack down and get that out of your way also. Okay, we're getting ready to put our new piston in. You can actually buy these individually. You don't need to buy a whole set of 8. This one was a little over 30 bucks, which included the ring, so it's really not a bad deal. Also, we brought it to the local machine shop and they were able to press the new piston onto the old rod for 10 bucks. Also, we went to one of the local auto parts chains that has a loan-a-tool program, and we were able to get the ring compressor here for $10, and then we got a cylinder hone for $25, and that's just a deposit. You get it back after you bring the tools back to them. Like I said, this engine has 225,000 miles on it, and the bearings are still in really good shape too, so hopefully this will be a nice, easy process. We're getting ready to push the piston into the cylinder now. You can't see it because we got the ring compressor on here, but it's actually marked with an F on this side of the piston, which means it goes to the front of the motor. In order to push it down, I actually turn the crank so it's the farthest away from the rod when it goes down. That way when I push it in, I won't damage the rod or the journals on there either. Goes in nice and easy. Use some kind of non-metallic surface to push the piston in. Like you can see, I'm just using the end of a hammer here. And that's all there is to it. Okay, on the rods here, it may be hard to tell from your angle, but these are what are called cracked rods. It's not like the old days with small block Chevys where everything was cut and polished nicely. Right here is actually a fairly rough surface where my finger is, along with the other side. And how they do it, I'm really not 100% sure, but I think they're a one-piece rod, and they probably cryogenically freeze them, and then, like I said, they just crack them right there. And what that does is it makes them stronger, and by doing this they only go together one way too. So when you take the rod apart, you know, try to mark both sides, which side goes together. That way you won't have any problems when you go to torque it back together. But like I said, I did this one before I took it apart. That's why I put an F on it. The F is towards the front of the engine, just like I did with the piston with the F. Okay, I already have the oil pan and the new oil pan gasket in, but I'll explain with the old one and how it goes in. There's 4 spots on the oil pan gasket that require sealant. But what you need to do before you put in the new oil pan gasket is you got to go into the block, and there's a little cavity about a 1/2 inch wide and maybe 1.5 inches long, where you got to use a tool like this and maybe even a razor blade and scrape out as much as you can. And then before you put the new gasket in, make sure you fill that void with a oil resistant gasket maker. And then after you have the oil pan sitting on the lower cross member is when you want to put the oil pan gasket in. And before you put it in, then you want to spread some more RTV type sealant on these 4 spots before it goes in. Okay, as you can see here, we already got the oil pan up. And the way you get the oil pan up is you put it in between the front cross member and the steering rack. As you can see, I still got the steering rack down. It's not bolted into its normal spot. And then with the engine, I also got it off its mounts and picked up probably 4 to 6 inches. And that'll give you enough room to put the oil pan right here in the front. You got to wiggle it a little because you got the starter back there, and then you got the steering shaft on this side. So once you get in there, you just got to wiggle it around a little, and then you can get it in place. And before you put the oil pan gasket on, just let it sit on this cross member here. And as it's sitting on the cross member, then you can have somebody feed the oil pan gasket in through the top with the RTV sealant and everything on it, and then put it on top of the oil pan. I'll show you in a minute how to put it in through the top. It's a little difficult too because, like I said, you got the oil pickup in the front. As you can see, the sump is in the front of this. What you want to do is get everything all lined up and start the oil pickup tube with the 13mm bolt, but don't get it in there tight. Just leave it hanging there so it's loose and it can flap back and forth, and that way you'll be able to clear the baffle that's in the front of the oil pan. So when you get ready to put the oil pan up, you can slide it over the oil pickup, And what I did next is I put one of the 15mm bolts in the back on the driver's side here, because your pickup is in the front, and just loosely put the 15mm bolt in the back, and that will line up your gasket and your oil pan, and that will give you about 1.5 inches in the front or 2 inches, and that'll be enough room to get a wrench in there and tighten up the 13mm bolts so you get the oil pickup tube in there tight. And then once that is in, then you can push the oil pan out the rest of the way and start the bolts. Okay, as you can see here, we've taken off the water pump, and we've also taken out the radiator. It's not necessary, but we were going to change those anyway, and it also gives you a little bit more room. But in order to get the oil pan gasket in, what you want to do is just kind of snake it down here. I also pulled the power steering line out of the way and put it over the lower pulley. And like I said, this gives you plenty of room to put in the oil pan gasket like this. And then from here, you can lay it on top of the oil pan and then spin it in sideways. But like I said, that's the best way we found to put the oil pan gasket in. Okay, just wanted to show you this. This is how we got the engine picked up. We got an engine crane here, and we just used some straps I had laying around. I wrapped these around the motor mounts on both sides, and like I said before, I removed the 2 bolts on this side and the 2 bolts on this side. And by wrapping this around the motor mounts and picking it up, I was able to pick up the engine about 6 inches. And that'll give you the clearance, like I said, to get that oil pan in and out. Okay, we're also going to replace the radiator in this. The radiator comes out the same way that the electric fans do. You got to take them out through the bottom. And the reason you got to take them out through the bottom is because you got air conditioner lines on the passenger side that get in your way. Anyway, here's the new radiator that goes in. The tricky thing is there's 4 bolts that hold it on, and it's bolted onto the air conditioner condenser. 1, 2, these are on the driver's side obviously, and then 3, 4 on the passenger side. It's a little tricky, but you can fish the bolts out with a 10mm socket and a long extension right through the grill. You just got to watch where they are. Anyway, here's the old radiator that came out. This is the factory one. As you can tell, it's got the new factory carrying handle right now. The plastic tank on it let go. And what you got to do before you put in the new radiator is you got to switch over the accessories. You got to put in the drain tube, and then on the front side there's a couple of these plastic things here for the airflow, and then on the back it's the same. You got to take these off, and they just slide off, and you can put them on the new radiator. Not a big deal, it just takes a few minutes. Oh, is it rolling already? Yeah. Damn AC lines. Get the hose in the hole there. There you go.
Alright, those are in. Nice.
Okay, we made a little bit of progress here. We have the left side, or the driver's side cylinder head installed. We also put on a new water pump, a new power steering hose, the high pressure side, and then the new radiator is also installed. We had a minor setback. I've always bought Felpro gaskets and never had a problem with them, but for some reason this headset had 2 left gaskets for the head and not a left and a right, so I had to order another set of head gaskets, and then I'll ship the other one back. But that set us back a few days there. One thing you want to be careful with when you put on the heads is there's a stud in the back of the heads, and what that does is it holds on the tubes that go to the front in the water pump. So like I said, once you get the head on, make sure you put that stud in to hold the tube in place. It's probably a good thing that we did the water pump now, because we had the rear stud removed, and then all we had to do was loosen this bolt, and that way the tube came out and gave us more room to work. Another thing we've also did is put on the valve covers, and then we only put 1 spark plug in each cylinder, and that way if we need to rotate the engine around, we're not fighting the compression. We still got a hole in each cylinder, so that helps us out a little. Okay, we got the passenger side head on now. We put it on the same way we did with the driver's side head. Put the exhaust manifold on first, because you can't even see the bolts on this side. It's still a 2-person job. One person's got to hold the head, and the other person's got to guide it into place and make sure none of the wires get pinched underneath it. And then if you look back here, here's the stud I was talking about earlier. The stud holds on the tube that goes up to the water pump, and then on the back side it's a ground. Each side has its own ground for the electrical harness connection, so just make sure you put those back on. Okay, we finished up on the passenger side cylinder head. We got all the push rods and rocker arms installed and torqued to spec. And before we put the valve cover on, we rotated the engine a few times, make sure everything was in the right spot and wasn't binding. And then put the valve cover on. Also, one thing you might want to do before installing the cylinder head is you may want to put the EGR solenoid, I guess it is, on the front of the head. It makes it a little bit easier because these two bolts here are a little bit difficult to get to once you got the head on the engine. Also, we have the electric fans put in, and we got those wired up. And the next thing you want to do is we put the catalytic converters in the exhaust back up and plugged in the 4 oxygen sensors, one on each manifold and one in each pre-cat on the exhaust system. And then the last thing we did was we put in the dipstick too, and that is attached to one of the studs that is really hard to get to on the front of the exhaust manifold, and it just slides into the oil pan. And I think that's about all we got done. Next step will be the intake manifold. Okay, we're getting ready to put the intake back on. Things you got to watch out for is, like I said, the most difficult part about taking the intake off is reconnecting or disconnecting the hose that goes to the brake booster. So before you set the intake all the way in place, just make sure you reconnect the hose. As you can see, we got the reconditioned cylinder heads on, and we already got the new valve covers on. We cleaned those up nice, and we also went in and changed a little bit of the wire loom cover here that was pretty well dried out, and cleaned up the inside of the engine bay, make it look nice. Okay, here's the intake manifold. We cleaned it up as best we could. We reached down there with a rag and got rid of as much carbon and oil buildup as we could. As you can see, we also got the new intake gaskets on here. And then another thing we did is we took off the throttle body and cleaned that out. I was actually surprised at how much buildup there was on the inside of that. Another thing you want to do is, if you did have the valve seat that dropped down, is we had a backfire in this, and when we had the backfire, it actually shot pieces of the valve seat back up the intake runners. So I looked down there with a flashlight. We fished out as many as we could with a magnet and a screwdriver, and then after we were done fishing them all out, we actually ran a leaf blower through here and blew out the rest of the intake, and we actually got a few more chunks that came out that way. Pretty sure we got them all, but if you don't clean out your intake, you might be in the same boat as you started with too, and it'll sound like you got a drop valve seat, even though you just got a big chunk of the old valve seat still floating around in there. But very important, clean out your intake before you put it back on. Okay, getting ready to put in the last coil pack here. On this Hemi engine, there are 2 spark plugs per cylinder, so you have 16 spark plugs, 16 spark plug boots, and then 8 coil packs. Each coil pack is good for 2 spark plugs. And what you want to do is you want to get the dielectric grease they provide in the kit. We bought all new boots here. We bought a set of 16 because we tore quite a few of them taking it out, which is probably to be expected with the mileage on this vehicle. And you want to put the dielectric grease right around the edge of the boot here. And the reason you do that is on the plugs that we took out, you can see the black mark right here around the plug, and that's where the plug actually, the boot actually fused itself to the plug there. So hopefully by putting a little bit of dielectric grease there, this will prevent that from happening. So next time you got to change spark plugs, you'll be able to get the boots off without tearing them. Okay, like I said, I already got the dielectric grease around the outside here, and just slide it on here. You'll hear it pop into place, and then take your coil pack of 2 and right down the cylinder holes. And the same thing, once you get close to the edge, you'll hear them pop in. Just like that. And then you got the 2 bolts that hold down each coil pack. And what we're going to do next, after we get all these coil packs bolted all the way in, is we're going to prime the engine. And how we prime the engine is we just don't connect the coil packs. We don't want this thing to start up without, having any kind of oil pressure. So we'll put in the oil that's required. I think it's like 6 quarts. and then we'll turn over the engine a few times, and then after we got the oil pressure built up, then we'll plug in the coil packs and get the engine running. Okay, the Hemi is back together finally. A couple things to note is when you take off the little clips that hold the wire harness in here, you're going to break a few of them, and hopefully when you put it back together you still got enough of them left where it'll still hold the wire harness in place. Same goes to the other side. Something I should have done is on the PCV hoses, this one's pretty cracked and dry rotted here, and then there's a small one over here too that goes into your air filter. I should have replaced those. They're only a few bucks. I'll order those up later online, not a big deal. Double check your fluids. I looked in the manual and it actually takes 7 quarts of oil, so make sure you got a full 7 quarts in there. I'll probably run it for about 500 miles and then do an oil change on it, just because we did the piston, and then I also had the oil pan off for a few days with the wind blowing around too. I might have got some dirt and stuff up there, so it's always best to just do an oil change. Doesn't cost that much. And then another thing is the coolant system takes about 2.5 gallons, and it took a long time to fill this thing up. It took about 3/4 of a gallon, and then we had to let it bleed down and bubble down, and then we put a little bit more in. And like I said, after we ran it and shut it off and drove it around the block a few times, eventually it took the full 2.5 gallons, but that took a long time for that to fill up with. But yeah, we'll start it up and you guys can hear what it sounds like, and it's back to normal again. Well, there it is, back to running again. Sounds good. Only thing I got left is I got to put the engine cover back on. That's just a piece of plastic. And then we'll take it for a drive around the block, and I'm happy with it. It'll still have the same performance, maybe even a little bit better, since I took all the carbon off those pistons there. Alright, here's the pile of parts that we replaced for this this project here. As you can see, this is the cylinder that gave us all the problems. This was the passenger side rear, the number 7 cylinder, and the valve seat came apart and broke up, and this is what caused all the damage here. It's from the valve seat bouncing around in there. If you look over to cylinder number 1, you can see where this valve seat's starting to come out too. I bought that special scope just to look down the cylinders and see which one had the problems. And lesson learned is I'm just kind of glad I did both heads instead of just the one head, because if you look at the other side, over here the exhaust valve is coming out too. So if I had only replaced the one head, I would have had to done the second head before not much longer, because that seat was coming out. Like I said, there's a place on the internet I bought these from. You buy them with an exchange, and this was the bulk of the money I spent here. These were 500 bucks for the pair and 40 bucks for shipping. And they give you a prepaid label, and when you're done with them, you mail them back, and they actually replace all the valve seats. And they say this fixes the problem so that the valve seats won't fall out anymore. So that sounded pretty good to me. That's why I bought them. And they come with a good guarantee too. And then if you look at all the other parts, I replaced the water pump while I was at it. Might as well. It's a little bit of cheap insurance. There's a rumor on the internet that says these have a plastic impeller. And as you can see on this one, yeah, they do have a plastic impeller. And then the one I replaced it with also had a plastic impeller. But just with the mileage I had in this vehicle, it was good cheap insurance. I replaced the hoses and the thermostat too. I'm not sure, this might have been an original thermostat. Same thing with that kind of mileage on it, I want to replace it. Some more cheap insurance is the head bolts here. And I bought these all online too. And these really weren't that expensive. I think it was like 18 or 19 bucks a side. And you're supposed to replace them anyway. They highly recommend you replace them. So like I said, it's some good cheap insurance. Then you got the full gasket set. Another one of my lesson learned is when you get all the parts in the mail, even if they're in sealed boxes, open them up. I had a problem with the Felpro gasket set I bought. I've never had a problem with them before, but they gave me 2 left head gaskets instead of a left and a right. So I had to wait another week as they shipped out a second set of a top end kit is what they call it. And then the other piece that I'm missing is the oil pan gasket, which almost looks like a valley pan here. We'll see if we can dig that out in a minute. But if you look at the radiator, this was the root of all problem. A big chunk of it broke out right here. and lost all the coolant, that overheated the engine, and then that's when the valve seats started falling out. So $100 radiator caused about $1,000 worth of damage here. And then while I was in there, my power steering hose was leaking too, and I figured that was a good time since it was really easy to get to, so I replaced the power steering hose. But that's about it. And if you have a problem with your early Hemi with the valve seats falling out, you basically got 4 choices. The first one is you can junk the car, because your car is basically worthless. Whatever pick apart will give you for it, 400 bucks. You can bring it to the dealer and they're going to tell you that you need a brand new engine, and who knows what that'll cost you, $5,000 to $7,000 probably. You can go to the junkyard and try to find a used motor and put it in there, but then you're going to have the same problem because they haven't replaced the valve seats. Or you can do what we did and replace these parts right here. And it's not really that hard of a job, it's just kind of time consuming. You and a buddy, it'll take you about a day to tear the engine apart, and then order all your parts, and then probably 2 or 3 days put it back together. And the reason it took so long is we're kind of meticulous. We cleaned out the engine bay, we cleaned the valve covers, every nut and bolt that went in this, we went over the wire brush and cleaned that up too. And we just took our time with it. We didn't work on it steady for 3 days straight, you know, a few hours here and a few hours there. But yeah, like I said, this is the best way to do it, and this is the way to save money too. We got about $1,000 in parts right here. But like I said, the car's worth more than $1,000 and we'll get a lot more life out of it, so this is the way we decided to go. Okay, and here's the piece I didn't show you before. This is the oil pan gasket. It also is like a windage tray here because it's got the metal thing that keeps the oil from being slung around too much. But you got to replace this too. And then there's a couple little spots where we put sealant in it. I think I talked about this earlier in my other video. But again, more cheap insurance just so you don't have any oil leaks. And then the other part we didn't show you was the piston that we replaced. We'll show you a photo of that. And the machine shop was kind enough to throw it away for us. I didn't feel like going dumpster diving for it to put it in this video, but the one piston was pretty screwed up too. You'll see that. And here are some of the more specialized tools that we use for this project. Obviously, you're going to need a good set of hand tools. We used all metrics wrenches and sockets for this project, from 8mm up to, I believe it was 21mm. And all 3 sizes, 1/4 inch, 3/8, and 1/2 inch drive. And we use the 1/2 inch drive to get the head bolts out. As you can see here, nothing really too special. We got some car ramps, got an oil drain pan. Used 2 floor jacks. Used the engine crane, and you saw that in the video how we used the strap to lift the engine up so we could get the oil pan off. Got a 1/2 inch torque wrench there. Everything on the top end needs to be torqued. Then we have the scope that we could look down the cylinders. That's really not a tool, that was more of a toy for this. We knew there was a problem in the top end, this just confirmed it. You really don't need that. And then we use the leaf blower to blow out the intake and get all the shrapnel out of there from when we had the backfire, and it spit all the valve seat into the intake. We didn't want it sucking back that valve seat, so that's why we used the leaf blower there. But really not too bad of a job. Everything gets torqued together. It's not like a small block Chevy where you have to adjust each valve. And that's about it. Good luck, guys.